talk falls into three parts. I'm going to outline my view, then I'm going to consider an objection that was given to me by David at a conference a few years ago, and then at the end I'm going to say a little about the imagination. That's Jock of the Bushveld. Anybody come across Jock of the Bushveld? It's good for my purposes because it's a book where it's just simply not clear whether it's fiction or non-fiction. So it's a guy's story, Percy Fitzpatrick's stories about his dog, but it's not really clear what happened to the dog, except that it was shot by accident at the end of his life. It's about the only thing that is clear, poor thing. It's a well-loved South African book. Okay. The fiction-non-fiction divide. Since Kendall Walton wrote My Meters as Make-Believe in 1990, there's been a philosophical industry on the philosophy of fiction to which various of us in this room have contributed and still contribute. There are, certainly early on, Greg Curry, in the book that came out roughly the same time as Ken Walton, said, there can hardly be a more important question about a piece of writing or speech than this. Is it fiction or non-fiction? And then a little later, in 1994, Lamarck and Olson said, the truth is that the classification of a narrative into fiction and non-fiction is of the utmost significance. Not only is it a precondition of making sense of work, but it determines how we should respond both in thought and action. I think that's false. I don't think that there is such a thing as the philosophy of fiction, and I think that the difference between fiction and our readers' processing of fiction and non-fiction have been greatly exaggerated. Okay, so this is the view. This is all fairly broad brush stuff, but as I take it that lots of you won't have, some small number of you won't have read my stuff. So that's why I'm going to do an overview. So this is the view that I'm opposing. When we read non-fiction, we form beliefs, and when we read fiction, we form make-beliefs. Okay, so if you pick up a newspaper that you trust and you read the newspaper, you form beliefs on the grounds of reading a newspaper. If you pick up a novel, you typically don't form beliefs on the grounds of reading a novel. You form imaginative states, which have come to be called make-beliefs. Okay, so that's a fairly standard ground-level statement in the philosophy of fiction. As we heard before, Anna, beliefs and make-beliefs have a different functional profile. So paradigmatically, beliefs cause action, make-beliefs don't cause action. We define our mental states functionally. That's very neat. We've now got a functional difference between beliefs and make-beliefs, which will help us to identify them. Okay, broadly, beliefs cause actions, make-beliefs do not cause actions. Here's an argument from the consensus view. We heard a sort of version of this in Alberto's paper. Suppose you're in a cinema watching a horror film. If you believed what you were seeing, you would run away. Okay, you've got Dracula munching through virgins on the screen. You do not run away. Therefore, you do not believe what you're seeing. Okay, you do not believe what you're seeing, but you're forming some kind of mental state, and it's not a belief. It's some kind of make-belief. Okay, so that's an argument that appears in literature, certainly in papers by Meskin and Weinberg, and it's also elsewhere in literature. It used to be very popular. Okay, so the big question that we need to ask ourselves is the mental state which is caused when you read a fiction the same or different from the mental state which is caused when you read a non-fiction? Okay, sorry, the other way around the board. Is the mental state caused by non-fictions, non-NFMS, non-fictional mental state, different from the mental state caused by fictions, fictional mental state? Okay, so I'm not going to beg any questions by calling the mental state caused by non-fiction a belief. I'm just going to label it neutrally as a non-fictional mental state, and the question is, well, is it a belief or is it something else? So NFMS is just what happens in the reader's head when they read the newspaper. Okay, and FMS is just what's happening in the reader's head when they read the novel. And the question is, are those two mental states different, as the consensus view would have us believe, or are they not different? Okay, which is what I would have you believe. So this is the consensus view. Okay, we have some inputs. We have the non-fictional mental state that's going on in your head there. We have outputs in terms of behavior according to the functional definition. And there's some relation here between the non-fictional mental state and belief. So typically, it causes your non-fictional mental state. It's going to cause you to believe something. So if you read in the newspaper that Petra has been flooded, that's going to cause you to believe that Petra has been flooded. Now, this is a bit, this may be a bit of a mouthful. I mean, sorry, a bit of an exaggeration here, because the consensus view doesn't really recognize, or it claims it doesn't need to recognize two different things going on here. It might just be because the inputs, the newspaper article is directly causing beliefs. It's not causing something else which causes beliefs, directly causing beliefs. So you might as well just cross that bit out at the bottom and just have inputs causing beliefs, cause outputs. Okay, that's the link to outputs, gives that mental state its functional profile of belief. And there you have roughly the Curry-Lamarck consensus on what it is to read a non-fiction. Okay, reading a non-fiction causes beliefs, causes outputs. I don't think I'm doing anybody too many, it's a bit broad brush, but I don't think I'm doing anybody too much of a disservice in explaining this. Okay, now, how can this be made more accurate? Okay, it's going to make this better in 3 easy steps. First step is on the input side. Okay, we can be more specific about the inputs. What I'm talking about here is reading fictions or non-fictions, or watching the cinema if you want to. I'm just going to ignore the cinema, but I can incorporate that easily. So you can watch a documentary film, or you can watch a fiction film. But basically, let's just stick with literature at the moment. The input is words. Okay? You're sitting in your chair and you're reading a book, right? Or you're sitting in a cinema, if you like, watching images on the screen. So first improvement is to be more specific about the inputs. The inputs are words or representations of some sort. Okay. This talk is going to be over in about 10 minutes at the rate I'm going. Second, I can slow down a bit on this slide. Second, so you've got the inputs being words there. Okay. Second, let's just think a bit about the outputs. Now, I've said that the outputs are behavior. Now, the relevant sorts of behavior, the behavior comes in 2 sorts. Okay, there's direct behavior and there's indirect behavior. Now, direct behavior is when we're acting in our environment. We're acting towards things that are going on. So if the famous Turin lion runs into the room, right? So we have a lion in the room. We're all going to run away from the lion, presumably. Right? Or somebody's going to start hitting the lion with a chair if they feel particularly brave, etc. But we're all kind of going, there's a lion here, and we're all going to act in the environment in which there is a lion. So we can directly act, and our actions are going to be dictated by our beliefs about where the lion is in our environment, and what we can do with our arms and coordinate with our arms and eyes, etc. So there's such a thing as acting in our direct environment. And when we act in our direct environment, in the way that's relevant to our case, there's the object to which we're acting has to be in our direct environment. Now, there's sort of all sorts of fringe cases here. So, for example, somebody who's controlling a drone in Afghanistan, say you've got some American soldier sitting in Washington or Pittsburgh or wherever they sit, and they've got a live cam on their drone, and they're able to drop bombs from their drone. So it looks as if they're actually active. It looks as if we've just got an artificial way for them of extending their environment. Their environment is, in fact, the environment in which they're acting is not the little room they're sitting in Washington, but the plains of Afghanistan. Okay? So there's all these kind of interesting cases as to what exactly counts as your environment. But still, there's direct. What I mean by direct action is actions that, to take the Alberto's case that was brought up earlier, when the people thought the train was coming towards them. Okay, they thought they were in danger from the train, so they leapt off their seats because they thought the train was coming rushing through. Okay, so they thought there was something happening in their environment, namely this train was heading towards them, which caused them to act. So that's what I'm just going to call direct action. Okay. Now there's indirect action that we can be caused to perform. Indirect action is when, say, you're reading the newspaper and it's about famine in Africa. You're not doing anything in your immediate environment, but you make a note to yourself, I really must go down to the bank and donate some money to Oxfam or to some NGO to alleviate famine in Africa, and the next day you get up and you do that. Or you're reading a travel section of the newspaper, and it's about how wonderful India is, and you make a mental note to yourself, you know, I'm going to go, next time I go on holiday, I'm going to go to India. So the action is being caused, but it's very different from the first sort of action. You're not acting in your immediate environment. All you're doing is having, if you like, it doesn't necessarily happen, or maybe it necessarily happens like this, but the standard case of it happening like at least the standard case is what you're reading is generating desires, the desire to go to India, the desire to alleviate famine. You've got certain beliefs, background beliefs about how to fulfill these desires, and you act on that belief-desire pair. Okay, you might do it the next day, you might do it a month later, you might do it a year later. So direct action is when we're acting around here. Indirect action is when our inputs are causing us to act. Okay, so the question then is for non-fiction is, with the outputs here, is it direct action outputs, or is it indirect action outputs? Okay, now it's not direct action outputs, right? If you're sitting reading a book about the Crusades, or you're sitting in your front room watching the television about a mad axeman in Damascus, right? There's nothing you can do because the Crusades happened in the 13th century. They're long gone. They're not in your environment. There's nothing you can do to help the Crusaders stuck in Jerusalem. Okay, you just keep sitting there and keep reading. If you're watching the news and there's a mad axeman in Damascus, similarly, there's no point in your leaping up, right? Because you're not going to get any closer or further away from the mad axeman by leaping up. You might get a yard further to them if you're heading towards Damascus. In your front room, you might get a yard further away. It's very unlikely you know which direction Damascus lies. It's going to be pointless moving a further yard away from Damascus to protect yourself from the mad axeman on the television. Okay, so there's absolutely no direct action required that the object which you're acting about is in your vicinity. When you're reading a non-fiction, because the inputs are a representation, there's no object in your vicinity, so there's no possibility of direct action. Okay, so output, no possibility of direct action. So you're just going to cross the outputs through because the beliefs that are caused by the words are not causing any action. Okay? I'll get back to secondary actions later. I might have to just cross that through at the moment. Okay? That's two of the three improvements. Third improvement is this. That two points here. The first point is that, as many people have noted, non-fictions do not consist simply of propositions that you believe. Okay? They might have hyperbole, metaphors, purple patches, thought experiments, all kinds of junk in the non-fiction, right? Which you're not supposed to believe, they're just supposed to aid your understanding in some way. So there's plenty in a non-fiction that you don't believe. So it's identifying that simply with belief. We need some relation here. Sorry, it's not quite, let's try a better slide. This is a better slide. Okay, so the better thing to say would be you've got these inputs of words, we have no direct outputs in terms of behavior, right? We don't want that to be beliefs, because let's just call it a mental state at the moment, and that has some kind of commerce of beliefs. Well, now what kind of commerce? Well, when you read a non-fiction, arrow going that way, it's going to cause you to form lots of beliefs, okay? But nonetheless, it's also the case that the arrows are going to go that way, because if you're reading a newspaper and it says the souks in Aleppo have been burnt to the ground, okay, that souks in Aleppo are on fire. So you read that in the newspaper. You're going to need some kind of background beliefs about what happens to things that are on fire, namely they get destroyed, very difficult to rebuild, and so on and so forth. So all kinds of background beliefs are going to go into your mental state. So you can work out the implications of what it is for the souks of Aleppo to be on fire. And they're going to go that way because you're going to get all kinds of beliefs from what you're reading. So that in there consists of mental states, some of which are going to end up as beliefs, some of which the metaphors, hyperbole, blah, 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 are not going to end up in beliefs. It's going to consist in things not simply from the input of words, but also things from your pre-existing structures. It's going to be quite a complicated thing, that, okay, built up from your background structures of belief and from your inputs in terms of what you're reading. Okay. So there we are. We've had the three improvements, and that is the new improved version of what's going on when you read a non-fiction. Okay? And here's the rabbit out of the hat. Da, da, da. That's exactly the same as what's going on when you're reading fiction. Okay? Because, oops, let's go back. Okay? When you're reading fiction, let's say you're reading The Great Gatsby, inputs are words, right? Causing some mental states. There's traffic with beliefs. So, for example, you're reading The Great Gatsby, you might form all kinds of beliefs about what Americans are getting up to in New York and location in the 1920s or 30s. You might form beliefs about the effects of alcohol, about the nature of jealousy, and so on and so forth. That's going that way. Going that way, you're going to need all kinds of beliefs to fill in the context. So when it says, there's a terrible car accident, you can work out the consequences of terrible car accidents just because of your background beliefs about what happens in terrible car accidents. Okay, and we all agree that with fiction, that there are no outputs. Okay, no behavioral outputs. That's kind of common ground to everybody. So it turns out that our improved version of what it is to read a newspaper is actually also the version of what it is to read a fiction. Okay, there's no big difference between what goes on in the reader's head between reading a fiction and reading a non-fiction. So what about these secondary things? So you could say, well, hang on a second. Beforehand, you were saying, well, if you read a travel section in the newspaper about holidays in India, you might book a holiday to India. Well, surely that's a behavioral output which is going to be characteristic of non-fiction and not characteristic of fiction. But of course it's not, because you could read E.M. Forster writing novels on India, and that could give you the desire to go to India, and combined with certain beliefs, that's going to make you book your holiday to India. If we're talking about secondary actions, namely actions caused by prompting desires, there's going to be absolutely no systematic difference between reading a non-fiction and reading a fiction. Okay, so there's no behavioral difference between reading a non-fiction and reading a fiction, and there's no other difference either. Right? So what goes on in the head of a reader of non-fiction just is what goes on in the head of a reader of fiction. Sorry, this is only an interim conclusion. I've got a little more to say yet. Okay. So the relevant question is how we process narratives. Once that question is answered, we can see there's no difference between the way we process non-fiction and the way we process fiction. Okay. So, unexpected. I didn't think that was the next slide, but never mind. What do we mean by the imagination? Let's go back a bit. One interesting thing about this picture is it just doesn't have a role for the imagination. You can do this all without the imagination. In fact, that's my preferred way of doing it. I'd rather we just dropped talk of the imagination when it comes to the philosophy of fiction and the philosophy of literature. You might wonder what a mental what that is in there. Well, that's just the representation of a narrative structure by a reader, whether that narrative structure is fiction or non-fiction. Plenty of psychology on that. Psychologists can tell us what's going on there very well. The connection between representation of narrative structures and beliefs is fairly well investigated. As I was saying earlier, it's also been the subject of psychological investigation as to how we represent these narratives in our head, and the thought is they're represented independently of our pre-existing structures of belief. So we've got that independently of our pre-existing structures of belief. So this all kind of looks as if it fits into what we know about psychology. Psychologists write thousands and thousands and thousands of pages on this without once mentioning the imagination, and good on them. Okay. So, but we're philosophers. What is meant by the imagination? Well, if it lies anywhere, okay, it's got to lie. It's going to be something to do with this, because it's not of imagination. That's just a book or a newspaper that doesn't exist. Those are our pre-existing structures of belief. So the imagination's got to lie there somewhere. Let's just call that the mental model, because as Dave was saying earlier, I'm relying on work done by Phil Johnson Laird and others on mental models. What it is to represent states of affairs in one's head. Okay. Now, David's objection. If a witch appears, and I think this is I thought I had an answer to this objection. The rest of this talk was a little bit undigested, because I thought I had an answer to this objection, And then at about sort of 5:30 or 6 o'clock this morning, I suddenly realised my answer was completely wrong. So I had to get up very early and rewrite this bit of the talk. So this is more suggestive, and I'm not sure that I've actually got this right. I think, so a concession to David, I think, it's quite possible he's right and I'm wrong, but let's just pretend I never said that. I shall persevere. If a witch appears in a fiction, namely, let's say Macbeth, then there are witches in the world of the fiction. Okay, so if witches appear in fiction, we don't say to ourselves, hang on a second, there's no such thing as witches, therefore there's no such thing as witches in Macbeth. Okay, if a witch appears in Macbeth, then there's a witch in Macbeth. Nonetheless, if a witch appears in a non-fiction, so this was the book that James I wrote on witches, non-fiction, it doesn't follow that there are witches in the world. Okay, so if a witch appears in non-fiction, we can cancel it, if you like, but we can't cancel witches appearing in a fiction. If I've got David's objection wrong, I'm sure he can tell me. But okay, now there seems to be there are two issues. So, and this ties into something David said in his talk, namely that in fictions we have this notion of a fictional world to which fictions kind of build up. But in non-fictions, we don't have an idea of there being a non-fictional world. The non-fictional world just is the world, right? Which is why non-fictions are answerable to the world. But the relation between a fiction and a fictional world is going to be something like constitution. But the relation between a non-fiction and the world is not going to be constitution. It's going to be something like, well, this is true if it corresponds to that, or whatever your favorite theory of truth is. So what I want to try and do is incorporate this worry that David has without altering my theory too much. Now, I think there's two issues that this objection prompts. The first issue is concerning what's true in a narrative. Okay. And the second is concerning what's coherent in the narrative. I'll come and explain what I mean by these two things. So, truth. Right. Now, I think in all narratives there's a two-step process. Determine what propositions are true in the narrative. Now, this might strike you as a bit controversial. I don't think it ought, but it might. Is that I think that the notion of what's true in a narrative is common to fiction and non-fiction. Let me give you an example. Okay, so fiction is, I think we all agree that certain things are made true in a fiction by, say, being asserted by the narrator in a fiction. That's right. But is there such a thing as being true in a non-fiction, which is not simply being true? I think there is. And I don't mean by true in a fiction, I don't mean anything metaphysically very loaded. I just mean something like, is it part of the set of propositions that go along with that narrative? Okay, is it part of the content of that narrative? Something like that. Okay, so it's not truth with a capital T. You could say what I'm trying to say without mentioning the word truth. Truth. Okay, so here's a favourite example of mine. I've always been a bit of a fan of the German Second World War General Erwin Rommel, for some reason. When I was very young and I read a biography of Rommel, they said that he died following an airstrike by the RAF on a car he was travelling in. Okay, it shows how old I am. And so now in that, let's call that Rommel 1. Okay, and then in Rommel 2, the next biography of him I read some years later, it said he was killed by a strike by aeroplanes bearing RAF colours, right? That were probably German aeroplanes. So in other words, he'd been killed in a kind of cover-up. And then the third biography, which I read relatively recently, it said that in fact he took poison. He was forced to take poison. That seems to be what actually happened to him. So there's Rommel 1, Rommel 2, Rommel 3, all giving three different versions, each giving a different version of his death. Now what I want to say is that in Rommel 1, it's true in Rommel 1, or it's one of the set of propositions attached to the narrative Rommel 1 that he was killed by the RAF. It's attached to the narrative Rommel 2 that he was killed by some kind of setup involving planes with English markings. And it's true, it's part of the content of the narrative of Rommel 3 that he took poison. I don't think that we could have an idea of what it was to understand the narrative unless we had a notion of what it is to be part of the content of the narrative. And that's kind of all I mean. So I think it's true for both fictions and non-fictions that we have to work out what's going on in the narrative, what's true in the narrative. Okay. Then, after we've determined that, it's determined what's true of the narrative answers to the way that the world is, and in Macbeth, it turns out, it doesn't really matter in Macbeth. The second step, in some narratives, truth narratives, let's call them, the second step applies to more of the content than it does in the other narratives, non-truth narratives. Now, that seems a bit mealy-mouthed. This is a sort of a nod to Stacey Friend's work, because Stacey thinks that even fictional narratives are answerable to the way the world is in a very massive way. She thinks that most fictional narratives are essentially realistic and just deviate from realism in a small way. But it's certainly true that there are things that, so witches and Macbeth, which just end up being false of the real world, but true in the narrative. And in non-fictional, in non-fictional works, there are things that could be false in the real world and true in the narrative. So I think I lost my thread a bit, but I think that in non-fictional narratives, two is a much bigger concern for us than it is in fictional narratives. But nonetheless, if Stacey is to be believed, then two does play some kind of role. Let's see if propositions are merely true in the narrative, we do not believe them. If they're both true in the narrative and not the way the world is, we do believe them. Okay, so witches and Macbeth are merely true in the narrative, so we don't actually believe them. But but things can be true in the narrative and answer to the way the world is, we do believe them. If they're true in the narrative and don't answer to the way the world is, we do not believe them in a non-fictional narrative. I lost my thread slightly through that slide, sorry. If we're talking about fictional works, which I know Dave didn't want to do, but just sticking with fictional works for a moment, the truth narrative and non-truth narrative is not the same as the non-fiction fiction distinction, just because there's lots of things that might be not answerable to the way the world is in a fiction, which might undermine that fiction. So let me give you an example. Actually, no, I'll leave that for a moment. I might come back to it. Okay, let's talk at the second question, coherence. Right? In narratives where truth is an issue, coherence is internal coherence plus a lot of coherence with the real world. So I think this is actually the trickier problem. So in Macbeth, we don't have to worry about there being witches, because Macbeth is not answerable to the way the world is. So there can be witches without the story being made incoherent. But if somebody comes along and says, look, here's a non-fictional story featuring, I don't know, a 5-head frog or something, then that's just not, or here's a better example. If somebody tells a story about somebody being raised from the dead, okay, so they're dead, somebody comes along and says, stand up and walk, and they're raised from the dead, right, a story basically about miracles, then I think that those risk being incoherent. Why? Well, because the story has to be coherent with the way the world is, with truth narratives. Okay? So with non-truth narratives, they don't have to cohere with the way the world is. I think that's the main problem. So in non-truth narratives, coherence is internal coherence. That should be in non-fictions, just to say. Coherence is internal coherence plus coherence with the real world. This is not to do with the relation with beliefs, but is a rule for constructing the mental model. Okay? And I think that's the tricky thing. Because if we go back to that, what I was trying to say in that earlier slide was that if we're just talking about witches in Macbeth, then what I want to try and do is to build the problem into the relation between the mental model and beliefs. Okay, because I've got that as part of my model anyway. So if I can just say something like, don't worry about witches and Macbeth, all that means is that we don't believe, is that although we believe they're part of the story, we don't believe they're part of the real world. So we can have them as believing they're part of the mental model and they're not part of the real world. That's fine, okay, nothing terribly worrying about my model, my theory then. The worry is that with coherence is to do with the construction of the mental model. Okay? It's not to do with the relation of beliefs, but there's a rule for constructing the mental model. So the rule for non-fictions is it has to cohere with the real world. The rule for fictions is it doesn't have to cohere with the real world. So that is a worry. But I don't know whether this doesn't seem to cut with the same distinction as the non-fiction-fiction distinction. So here's some famous examples. So David Lewis pointed out that in the Sherlock Holmes story of the Speckled Band, right, which is a fiction, there's a snake in the fiction which has two sets of properties. One is that it can slide down a bell rope, and the other is that it can bite venomously. Okay, now it turns out that there's no snake which has those two properties, or at least all the properties that Conan Doyle described. Because if it's a viper, then it can't slide down a bell rope, but if it's a constrictor, it can slide down a bell rope but can't bite. Now this is a fiction, but the fact is that the fiction doesn't cohere with the real world, and we take that to be a fault with the fiction. It's a fault with the story. We don't just say, okay, it's fictional that there's a snake which has properties of both a viper and a constrictor. We say Conan Doyle messed up, the story is incoherent, we have to just do the best we can. Okay? Which is what we also say when we come across stories with five-headed frogs. So look, it doesn't cohere with the real world, with the actual world. So the story itself is incoherent. So what I think is that there's a class of narratives which you could say roughly is non-fictional narratives plus fictional narratives that are supposed to be realistic. And those narratives have to cohere with the actual world. If they don't cohere with the actual world, then they are they're incoherent. Sorry, I told you it was a bit indigested, but I hope that shows at least part of the way, or part of the answer I want to give today. But I think this is where the issues come out, I think. But if we then ask ourselves, well, what is the imagination? Okay, so let's just nip back to this. So what is meant by the imagination? As I said, it's going to be if we're going to use the imagination at all, it has to correspond to this in some way. So we could say that imagination refers to all the propositions in the mental model of non-truth narratives. That is a mental model governed by the rule that there does not need to be lots of coherence to the real world. So we could say, so what do we mean by the imagination? Well, we could say this. I'm going to restrict the imagination to the mental model of stories that don't correspond to the real world. Okay, so they're stories where there doesn't have to be lots of coherence to the real world. That's what I'm going to mean by the imagination. But there are a number of worries with this. I mean, first of all, the imagination then doesn't refer to a propositional attitude, but it's what some people have been meaning by meta-representation. So the term imagination is capturing all the propositions in a mental model. Now we know that some of the propositions in a mental model are going to be beliefs, and some of them are not going to be beliefs. They're going to be what Stacey Brent calls mere make-beliefs. Okay, so what you're saying is what I mean by the imagination is just all these propositions. So it's a set of propositions. But that is compatible with some standard views of the imagination. So, for example, this is what Amy Kine says as a sort of truism about the imagination. Imagination is a primitive mental state type or group of types irreducible to other mental state types. Well, in this view, it's not. It's just a set of mental state types. Maybe this is a bit closer to what Alberto was saying, is that by imagination, I just mean it's the set of propositions in the mental model, whether they're beliefs, make-beliefs, spatial information, day-ray, etc., etc., etc. And there's no clear distinction between fiction and non-fiction because those mental models, such a mental model is going to include both non-fictions and realistic fictions. Also, there's lots of this. So up there it says a mental model governed by the rule there does not need to be lots of coherence in the real world because there's going to be some, as we saw, the Holmes case needs some coherence with the real world. Non-fictions need a lot of coherence with the real world. It's all going to be on a continuum. So it's going to be rather vague as to what we imagine and what we don't imagine. And then, of course, there's cases that David mentioned earlier that we needn't worry about too much, which is that in the actual world, what counts as a fiction and what counts as a non-fiction is enormously contested at the moment, and the boundary seems broadly broken down anyway. So perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about that. So how else could we use the term imagination? And I think maybe this, I thought perhaps this is what David meant by the imagination, but maybe I'm wrong, which is the imagination refers to all propositions in any mental model. So you say, well, I'm going to use the term imagination as the name for my representation of the narrative, whether fiction or non-fiction. Okay, so it's obviously unrelated to the fiction, non-fiction distinction, incompatible with the view that Amy Kind mentioned earlier. And finally, a third option, maybe by imagination we could mean mere make-believe, that is, those propositions in the mental model which we do not believe. So if I'm reading a Sherlock Holmes book, say, and it says London is the capital of England, that's a belief in the mental model, but it says Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that's not a belief, that's a mere make-believe in the mental model. So maybe we should use the term imagination just to refer to those things in the mental model which we don't believe. But again, that's unrelated to the fiction, non-fiction distinction, because again, there are plenty of propositions in the mental model we do not believe in non-fictions. And all it captures is the difference in attitude of a proposition being entertained rather than believed. And we already have a perfectly good way of making that distinction, so I'm not sure we should use the imagination to mark it. So I think when I'm just exploring options as to what we could mean by the imagination, if once we've adopted this mental model picture, I'm just not sure that there's any sensible candidate for being the referent for the term imagination. So we've already got the mental model. The imagination is either going to pick out the mental model in its entirety, or it's going to pick out elements of the mental model, and neither of those seem particularly good options. Other worry about this mere make-believe, it's nothing to do with the functional role. Ever since Kendall Walton said imagination should refer to something that we do with a proposition. But all this does is just mark a distinction between those elements of the mental model that we believe and those elements which we don't believe, and says nothing about its contribution to the mental model. Thank you.